Welcome to another live edition of the Who's Better Baseball podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein, joined by my co-host, Patrick Lyons. We're going to be talking about a lot today, breaking down the best rivalries in this sport. We're going to go through some players who've gotten off to a slow start that we think might bounce back and others that we think this might be who they are. But before we get into any of that, you were watching SNL last night, saw Caitlin Clark, and you were wondering, is there a Major League Baseball player who we could see at SNL at some point in the near future here? Who do you got? Who do you like?
Man, right now I don't know that there are any of those true superstar folks that are in MLB. I think that could be a host. And again, Caitlin Clark just jumps on Weekend Update, and immediately the mind starts going, okay, how does this relate to baseball? I'm obsessed. And I love that Saturday Night Live too. I've got like documents of like all the different hosts that are athletes and baseball players on SNL. And so I think I don't know that we have a host yet, unless they do a baseball version of Space Jam, and then Aaron Judge needs to kind of go and pitch that movie. But you can see Aaron Judge popping in on a Weekend Update if there's some kind of day game. If something historic happens, more likely than not, you probably have to wait till next season in the winter time. But Shohei Ohtani, I can't see him really being on. Mike Trout, I couldn't. But you're saying before we started recording that there's some other names out there that definitely seem to have a personality, or at least something that they could plug, right?
So one that just popped into my head now actually is Juan Soto while he's on the Yankees, or if he remains on the Yankees. That New York connection with SNL. Obviously, maybe those are the guys. Francisco Lindor. The one that we were talking about before record was Mookie Betts. The reason why I said Mookie Betts is because he has a podcast. I think it's with Bleacher Report, but he's at least venturing into the media space, so you could see him maybe being comfortable with it. The other guy that jumps out to me is Bryce Harper as like one of baseball's biggest stars that I've seen crossover nationally. But there's just not a lot of baseball players that seem to have that national appeal. And Otani's the biggest one. And we all know he's not getting on an SNL set. I mean, he rarely gets in front of the media. He's not getting in front of a live audience.
I think the best options are probably players who are retired. I know that, Keenan Thompson does a great David Ortiz impression. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but that's hilarious. Yeah. They love when someone does an impression of someone who's real, bringing that person in to kind of, they confront each other, if you will. So I think that very much, could be entertaining. Look, anytime that baseball gets referenced on Saturday Night Live is always good, because they kind of have their finger on the pulse. They need to talk about what's current and what's happening right now. And Caitlin Clark, frankly, is one of the things that's really happening right now.
It's crazy. I was even saying before we recorded that, is Caitlin Clark more relevant than most baseball players just nationally? I mean, there was such a firestorm of attention that got brought to her and that Iowa team, and just in general because of everything she's done over the last couple of years, where we've seen so many different people talking about her that you don't see, a baseball story crossing over to platforms like SNL that much anymore.
I wonder if more people would know who Ippei Mizuhara was.
Right as you said that, I was thinking, like, he's not going to be on SNL, but I'm surprised that Weekend Observation, I'm surprised that they haven't done any of that at some point, because it is a story that's ripe to be parodied on a show like SNL.
Oh yeah, they're now that more information is starting to come out, and even when you know the truth, look, don't let the funny get in the way of what's reality, right? So Ohtani does look to be a little bit more clear here. Still isn't going to end up looking good when this all thing gets said and done, because anytime you're taking advantage of it, it does make you look like you were a little ignorant about this, or you should have gone about things a little bit differently. So definitely not a good look for one of the best players in the sport. But yeah, Saturday Night Live at some point is gonna dip their toe in that water and
You
and
would
make
think
them look
so.
bad. Yeah.
You would think so. And yeah, that's a sketch that you don't want to see if you're Shohei Ohtani, but I'm kind of curious how they could actually spin it.
They could very easily just use the memes that are already out there with Ohtani on deck, Mookie Betts waiting to get into the batter's box, and you see Ohtani, Betts, and then, okay, great. Ohtani's at the plate. Who's to his right? Freeman. Otani, Freeman. Oh, all right. Like it kind of writes itself in very many ways. So
Yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. I have yet to connect those dots, so it is kind of crazy that he's hitting with bets right behind him now. Luckily, he's exonerated, so so hopefully people will at least trust that there's going to be no ramifications coming his way. But let's awkward transition. Let's talk about the Dodgers playing baseball. We're going to go through the best rivalries in the sport, and Dodgers Padres is becoming a very fun rivalry. It's a newer one because the Padres haven't always been as competitive as they've been lately. And the Dodgers, you would say Dodgers Giants, probably historically a better rivalry in that division, but now it sort of has been Dodgers Padres. So we'll start there. How do you like that as the best rivalry in the sport right now?
I think it is. I think it has to be a number one, and a lot of that happened, and a lot of that transpired where the focus shifted to the West Coast even before Otani, even before these most recent moves. I think the juice that San Diego brought in, so many exciting players, and really making that like a marquee event. No love lost between the two Southern California teams, between LA and San Diego. They're incredibly close, about 2 hours apart. So there's a lot of history between those two teams, with the Padres really being the younger brother that gets beaten up almost every single season. So as soon as the Padres had some juice going, as soon as the fans had some juice going, it really made it, some must see television. And if you go back to, the 90s is what I think of the Yankees and Red Sox rivalry. Even in the early 2000s, they had some of the biggest stars. And I think that's where it all comes down to. Even in the 70s and 80s, the best rivalries were loaded with the best players on the teams that faced each other the most frequently. And so, there's a good dispersal of star players right now all around MLB. But if you're talking about star power, less so for the Padres these days, but in the last couple of years, it's really been Dodgers Padres.
Yeah, I think if any or casual baseball fan will always point to Yankees Red Sox, and that's the one that historically has sort of the biggest pull. But I don't know. For me personally, it feels like that rivalry hasn't meant as much lately, and that's
Yes.
partially due to what's going on with the Red Sox. But even the Yankees, it's been a while since they've been on top. So, what about that rivalry? Because you could still make the argument, and I think you'd almost have a winning argument to just say, well, it's of course the best rivalry in sports is Yankees Red Sox. It can't be anything else. It's kind of like Celtics Lakers, but it's one of those things where now we look at the Orioles and the Yankees for the AL East this year. That might be the rivalry to watch.
It's definitely not Yankees Red Sox. And I think, right now, at least with those teams, it is a group of players that represent the Yankees and a group of players that represent the Red Sox. But in the 90s and 2000s, those players were dying for the laundry. They were, I'm pinstriped through and through, and it's personal. It's Yankees versus Red Sox rather than your team versus my team. And you go back to Saturday night where Jerks and Profar, get pitched inside a little bit, and you got benches clearing. I think that's what elevates a rivalry. These bench clearing incidents happen all the time, and we saw it between Milwaukee and Baltimore. We're not going to really remember that in a while. But next season, even when they meet again later on this year, Padres, Dodgers, hey, our bench is going to clear again. Is there some juice? Some words going back and forth. Will Smith saying, hey, Jerks and Profar, look, we don't throw out irrelevant players. Like, shots fired. Like, that happened a lot between Yankees and Red Sox. And, I think sides just gotten very friendly against one another. And so there are still really good rivalries, but when you have that extra bit of heat between the players for whatever reason, and there's that back and forth, it definitely elevates one rivalry over another. And we're not really seeing that from Yankees Red Sox. I think Yankees Orioles might be where we really start to see that in the coming weeks, months, and seasons.
You need playoff matchups to really heighten it. And the Dodgers Padres, that rivalry got better when the Padres bounced the Dodgers a couple years ago, because it was like, all right, now this Padres team that always been beaten up on, well, now they had that. So you look at some other ones that I threw in there. The one that jumped out to me was Rangers Astros as like one to keep an eye on. We saw them last year meet up in the playoffs, a fantastic series. They were down the stretch for the division too. And there's also that, right, where you see a team really celebrating grabbing that division title at the end, the way we saw the Astros, like once again, we've done it. And then the Rangers came right back and got them in the playoffs. That's a rivalry that I think has some legs to it. But then I guess the question is right now, are the Astros okay? And that might impact throughout the season. If this dynasty has a shorter shelf life than we all thought, because the Rangers aren't there going anywhere in the long term here. That's one way that one can get impacted. But overall, I think Rangers Astros is one that we definitely got to keep our eyes on.
Postseason battle is definitely integral in keeping and spicing up these kind of rivalries. I mean, it seemed like the Mets in Atlanta were doing that right in the 2000s for a very long period of time. And you're right. I think Texas and Houston is that next one where people pay attention, right? The diehards are definitely going to be watching. Baseball fans, I should say, are going to be watching that. Might not have the star power as some of the other matchups, but definitely, as you said, like they're in the state, they're battling for the flag of Texas. And they're two teams that are still trying to stay relevant. They're competitive. Rosters are loaded, and you've got that injection of youth too. That's another piece that gets it going. Is Evan Carter and Wyatt Langford. Those guys, if bench is clear in one of their games, they're going to remember that from years to come and say, oh man, look, the Astros, they're like this, or I've dealt with this Astro team. I know that they behave in this certain way, and that just fuels the fire. So anytime that you get some of these younger players injected into a rivalry like that, it really just increases the likelihood of it happening for years to come.
We just saw it at the beginning of this season with Rhys Hoskins and Jeff McNeil. Hoskins not even a Philly anymore, but that bad blood carried over. He's still a Philly at heart. And a kind of innocuous slide in second base becomes so much more because of that history. Speaking of the Phillies, we would be remiss if we did not mention Phillies Braves with the matchups they've had in the playoffs the last couple of years. An interesting note, though, I had with my other show, Locked On Mets, we did a crossover this past week with the host of Locked On Braves. And when we were talking about the rivalry, he said that for Braves fans, and this could just be his opinion, he said he still looks at the Mets as their chief rival. I guess they hate the Mets more for whatever reason, but I would say with what's relevant right now with those two teams and the likelihood that they'll meet again in the playoffs for a third straight year, Phillies Braves is another one. And we saw it when they matched up early this season. There was a lot of buzz in that ballpark.
Yeah, and you told him that you thought it was Phillies and Atlanta was the better matchup?
Yeah. I was asking him. I was more asking him, what the state of the Mets Braves rivalry was. How does he view the Mets now? And I was shocked by his answer. I thought the Mets are kind of irrelevant now. That's what I was expecting to get from him. That's what I was trying to get from him, kind of. And I got something completely different. So that answer surprised me. But again,
for that, Ryan, I have to say, attaboy. Attaboy, Ryan. I mean, come on. It's not even close. I mean, the Mets also, again, going back to the rosters, right? The component, like who has been on the Mets for the last couple years that was a part of their last real postseason contender, right? There's only so many through lines that go through that. Yes, there's the star power. We can check that box off for the Mets. More 2022 and 2023 rather than this past season. But no, it really is all about Phillies and Atlanta. And if you ask most fans and they want to know, hey, what's the best rivalry? It's Philly and Atlanta. And the fact that you being a Mets guy is saying, hey, come on, like let's keep it real here. It's a no-brainer.
I think the Mets are just living rent free in both Philly and Atlanta's minds for whatever reason. Because remember with the backup catcher in Philly, his name's escaping me for a second here.
Garrett Stubbs.
Remember Stubbs last year at the celebration after they beat the Braves, and it was like, F the Bravos and always the Mets, So like, it's one of those things where I think that those three teams in general just generally hate each other, and you like to see that in these divisions. And that's the one thing I wouldn't like if they did add expansion and realign, is if they shake those things up where some of those rivalries went away, because those are the ones that you want to stick to. Like even like Yankees, Blue Jays, it's not one that we're going to put on top of our list, but those fan bases, like they still hate each other and they always are excited to watch those two teams square up. We'll talk about that later as well, because I think they're about to play starting this week. But yeah, I mean, like Yankees, Blue Jays, another one, not the top of our list, but that's a rivalry.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, if the NFC East could keep the Cowboys and the Giants together, I think we can find a way to keep Atlanta and Philly and the Mets together. And
Yeah.
also, too, by the way, what fan base do you think the Marlins fans dislike the most, or team they dislike the most? Also, probably Mets. If
Now
you ask the Nationals, also probably the Mets. So, I mean, you know what? The Mets are just the exception to every rule, really, when it comes to rational baseball thinking, right?
I think so, but the funny thing is because I'm a Mets fan. I live in South Florida, so I know Marlins fans, and I'll tell you the fan or the team that the Marlins fans hate the most is the Marlins. They
I
can't.
was just about to ask you. I was going to say, what team drives the Mets fans the craziest? Also, the Mets.
Yeah, exactly. But to answer your question on that part of it, the Braves. I hate the Braves more than the Phillies, but it depends on the season. You never know.
Yeah.
All right, so let's cut. We should mention some rivalries in the Central before we close it out, because Cubs Cardinals is a long-standing rivalry, but the Brewers are right there with those teams so far in the Central the last couple of years. So again, when teams are good, they become more relevant in rivalry talk.
Yeah, and you've got so many storylines between those clubs. Obviously, the previous offseason, Wilson Contreras, going from the Cubs to St. Louis, that keeps it going a little bit. Obviously, everything from the offseason with Craig Counsell going from his hometown club down to the Chicago Cubs on the north side. So, I mean, there's still plenty of juice to go between all of those teams in the Central. And yeah, look, they're not as sexy as the coasts are. Again, going back to the players that are there, but there's a long-standing rivalry between all of these clubs back even when there was only 4 divisions, 2 in each league.
Yeah, no, it's whatever teams you're seeing a lot, you're always gonna generally just hate a little bit more. Let's get to an answer though. So you got to pick one. We've talked about all these different rivalries. Which one is the best in baseball for this season, or just right now?
Right now is Dodgers, Padres. Joe Kelly wiping the tears from his eyes, calling Manny Machado a crybaby. He's now back with the Dodgers. Will Smith calling Jurickson Profar irrelevant. The star power between the Dodgers, a little bit less so with the Padres, but it's still there. It's still must-see TV. And so for my baseball buck, when the Padres and Dodgers lock horns, you have to be watching.
I agree, but personally, I would take Phillies Braves, just because I think there's a chance that the Padres don't put it all together this year, and that rivalry may lose steam. I think we're going to be heading towards a collision course again. Phillies Braves. Maybe this time the seeding works out where we see them in the NLCS, but they're going to meet again in the playoffs, and the Braves are going to have a lot to prove in that series, because you can't get bounced by your division rival 3 years in a row after winning the division. I'm assuming at this point it'd be 7 years in a row or something crazy. So we'll see how that settles itself once we get to October.
And you don't think Chris Sale is going to come in lefty on Bryce Harper, bringing some of that high cheese? Like, that's electricity waiting to happen right there.
That really is, yeah, especially if that ends up being, first inning, if Sale gets the game once. So which now all of a sudden with the Strider injury, Chris Sale very well could be the Braves ace come playoff time. So that's just, it'll be a great series to watch once we get to it. But we got a lot of season ahead of us before we do. There's some players that need to hear that. There's a lot of season left, guys. You can still come back. Which hitters off to slow starts have us most concerned? I mean, both of the sections from the notes that you established here have a guy on the top of it that I'm past concerned. I'm just out on them. And we start with Javi Baez. I just think he's done.
Yes, his I think OPS, not batting average. OPS is under 300 going into our recording on Sunday. So that's, we're at a point now where you're not concerned. You're just starting to think this kind of is who the player is at this point. Now, I don't think he'll stay at 300, but are we talking about a season where is maybe one of the worst players in it still? Yes. And so, right. You're not quite as concerned anymore. You're disappointed if you're a Tigers fan. You're probably disappointed too if you're a Cubs fan, but I think Cubs fans are dealing with that a lot right now as they look around the league And their Cubs fans are a little surprised right now that Chris Bryant is receiving such vitriol in Colorado after everything Bryant was able to do as a Rookie of the Year, follows it up with the MVP. They win the World Series in 2016, still very much beloved on the North Side, but he's been struggling in a major way with the Rockies. The numbers have not been good in his 2 seasons. We're going into year 2 and 2+, and he's still yet to play 162 games with the Rockies. He sat out on Sunday with a lower back issue. And even when he's been on the field, he hasn't been very good. There's been multiple 9th inning, 3 swings outside of the zone with the bases loaded to strike out that we've seen. And fans have been booing him. And it's been hard, I think, for the fan base in general to figure out what to do with this guy that was, so great and is getting paid, such top dollar. But for Cubs fans, they still love their Chris Bryant. They're still going to love Javi Baez, but both those two guys right now are really struggling, and the doubts are strong enough where, or the concerns maybe are strong enough that they're just full-fledged doubts now.
It's, I was just looking at the contract details on both of them. Javi's got 4 years left, not quite 100 million, but close. I think it's 98 if you look at from the start of this season. And Chris Bryant looks like it's like 130 over 5 left. I mean, these guys, I know I wrote an article, worst contracts in baseball at some point. I think it might have been this offseason. And these guys were featured prominently on that list. And with Bryant, I've always felt like, all right, there's a good player in there somewhere. I just haven't given up on him. But and especially when you have a guy that's injured, like Javi Baez, he's been healthy this whole time. He's just terrible. I mean, he's been on the field and hasn't been able to produce. At least Chris Bryant, you can use injuries as an excuse, but how long, as someone who's been watching these games a lot closer than I have, how long is that a valid excuse? Are you seeing any semblance of hope in at least, his discipline in these at-bats, or has he just looked completely lost?
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to say he has looked rather lost at the plate, and even talking with some people within the Rockies staff saying, so what's going on with Chris Bryant? We're kind of curious where, if you could pinpoint something, and, hearing a comment of get in line, because a lot of people really want to know around the team right now. And, he's putting in the work, good clubhouse guy in general, but at the end of the day, for the fan base, they're seeing a guy with a pretty hefty price tag coming right after the heels of the Nolan Arenado trade, and really just kind of, being the human embodiment, the representation of the ownership right now of different things. I mean, Ian Desmond was booed, and his contract was half of what Chris Bryant was making. And it was so bad for Ian Desmond that he basically left $20 million on the table during the pandemic to say, I'd just rather not even be around this organization, this fan base right now, because of obviously things happening during the pandemic and whatnot. But even still, it's kind of been a bad scene for Chris Bryant and the Rockies right now. And there's little hope. Maybe if he gets healthy, you can get something out of him again, right? We saw Albert Pujols, really banged up for most of his tenure with the Angels, and then was able to put together 6 months with the Cardinals there at the end, where you said, oh, maybe he's got another year left in him, but he left it all out there. He emptied the tank. So I think for Tigers and Rockies fans, they're hoping that Javi Baez and Chris Bryant can either empty the tank or just do some kind of reset, factory reset to go back to what they were paying when they first signed him.
When you see all these former Cubs, and I guess it's not each of them, because Contreras was still good with the Cardinals last year, and Rizzo's had his moments with the Yankees, but playing those day games at Wrigley is such a unique experience, and as a young player, you come up in that. I don't know how that alone can zap you of everything, just leaving it. I feel like it's part of the issue. But yeah, it's amazing to think these guys that we thought were going to be, prominent stars in the game for a really long time just have not found their way back. And that a lot of them sort of peaked. I mean, the best guy from that team is now Kyle Schwarber. I mean, Kyle Schwarber from that 2016 team, he's the guy that's still producing. So it's just been a really surprising turn. And another guy on our list here, since we've talked a little Cubs, is Cody Bellinger. He's got off to a rough start. He's definitely someone to watch, right? There was a reason that there wasn't a team out there, unless it was just complete mismanagement from Scott Boras. But
no, it wasn't that one. Definitely within that one.
Yeah, it wasn't that Scott, I had to think that they could have got like a 7 for 150 somewhere, but regardless, he settles on the short-term deal. He does have a couple of years, but if he puts up even one bad season on this 3-year deal and doesn't get right back into the market, I don't know if that 7-year deal will ever come for Cody Bellinger. It's not to say he can't bounce back. We're in the middle of April, but it's just a name that we're going to be watching really closely this year.
It's even harder for him, I think, to go out and get a contract of that size, partially because he's done this before, where there's too many ebbs and flows in his career, despite the fact that you say, well, there's still an MVP caliber candidate that's in there, but I might not get it every single year, right? There's some questions about those dips in performance, like you said, that we're seeing at the start of 2024. So I think that is definitely going to negatively impact his market. We'll wait and see if he decides to keep Scott Boras as his agent. We know Jordan Montgomery decided to go a different way. So his next contract, Scott Boras will not be touching any of that. So he's been a disappointment. Here's a guy that was also a Cub for a minute. You might recall Nick Castellanos. He's struggling a little bit for the Phillies. If you go back and actually look at what he's done in the regular season with Philadelphia, it hasn't been that great. It hasn't been necessarily all-star caliber. I think he might have been an all-star last year, but still he's been more of that postseason player. He's been a catalyst for the team in those big moments. We know if something tragic happens in the world, Nick Castellanos is going to hit a home run. So if the rapture ever does come, Ryan, Nick Castellanos for MVP. I mean, that's a lock. I think we know that. So he's another guy that's been struggling a little bit, that I probably have less concerns than the Baez, Bryant, maybe even for Cody Bellinger, because I think Bellinger has that higher ceiling that you're going to miss out on if he doesn't really come to fruition, whereas Castellanos, I don't think has, those same general expectations.
Castellanos, it's kind of an on-year, off-year, at least that's what it's been in Philly. I mean, it's interesting. You actually look at 2022 and 2023, got his stats pulled up. The average is within 10 points of each other. The on base, same thing. I'd imagine the strikeout and walk rates are probably similar. The only difference is 2023, he hit 29 home runs. 2012, he hit 13 home runs, and he drove in an additional 44 runs with all those homers. So he's got to drive the ball out of the yard if he's going to be effective. And then we saw kind of a similar thing in the playoffs, if I remember. I'm trying to find the postseason stats now, because he had one series. Yeah. The NLDS last year, he hit 467 and hit 4 bombs. And then in the NLCS, he disappeared. 1 home run, struck out 11 times in 24 at-bats, hit 42, 0-4-2. So he's a streaky hitter in general, which also means, hey, he can have a hot streak and balloon those numbers. But I think luckily for him and the Phillies, I don't think Castellanos is going to necessarily kind of tank their season. They've had good results with the struggling Castellanos. I'm not overly concerned, but I also wouldn't be surprised if Nick Castellanos looked like 2022 Nick Castellanos again. Like that wouldn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, I would agree about that. I know I talked a little bit about Chris Bryant, seeing him and those concerns and those worries. From the Mets side of things, Francisco Lindor off to, somewhat of a slow start. I feel like this might be somewhat common for him, because you look at the end of every season and he ends up putting those numbers up. Are you concerned about the slow start from Frankie, or is this kind of par for the course?
I'm not too worried about it, because he is a slow starter in general. This has been a really, it's gotten a little drastic with how slow of a start it has been, but they just went on a road trip. I got to check this weekend if he struck out, but they went on a road trip this past week for Cincinnati and Atlanta, and across the 6 games played, 29 plate appearances, he didn't strike out once. So that just tells me, like, all right, his timing is still off a little bit, but he's not giving up at bats. From what I've seen, the at bats have generally been pretty good. His right-handed swing is fine. So the problem is that's the shorter side of the splits that you're going to get, because he's going to face way more righties. So he needs to get that left-handed swing going. I've seen Mets fans say just bat right-handed all the time. Look, Lindor hasn't faced a righty batting righty probably ever. So I don't know if that is the best call to action for him. Last year, his splits actually were a little bit more skewed, where slightly better left-handed. It was kind of the same guy each way. I think Lindor is going to be fine. And what he gives you with the leadership and the defense, you don't worry about it too much. It's definitely a guy to monitor, but I think he'll be okay.
Yeah, you got to hope so if the Mets are going to make a go at it here in Pete Alonso's final season before free agency. And look, if we're talking about big, burly first baseman, Spencer Torkelson is
Yeah.
one of those players where, we like the Tigers roster. We like the additions that they made in the offseason, but that only works if you get major production out of those key young players that are still establishing themselves. And Spencer Torkelson obviously is a huge part of that. So, his performance at the plate in the early going, obviously a little bit concerning there. We know that with a lot of those central teams, even in the Northeast, it's been cold. The bats really don't get heated up a little bit early or this early in the year, so you can certainly make an excuse. But if the Tigers are really going to make a run at this thing, Torkelson definitely needs to be a major part in the middle of that lineup.
Yeah, he's the one that I looked at where I thought this conversation was the most interesting because we just like with Lindor, we're like, all right, we've seen slow starts, we've seen him break out of it. And you could say Torkelson last year, he was very much a second half player. I'm actually pulling up the splits right now to see exactly how much of a difference it was. He batted 220 to 230, but the WRC plus went from 95 in the first half to 121 in the second half. And it was because of that second half that a lot of people were expecting him to break out this year. He had 19 home runs in the second half, 12 in the first half. The thing for me with Spencer Torkelson is you look at these rebuilding teams, right? With Baltimore, you had Adley Rutschman and Jackson Holiday 1-1, going first round, first overall. We've seen Royce Lewis. When he's on the field, he looks like that guy. Spencer Torkelson, a first overall pick, he is so important to the Tigers' rebuild and now trying to contend because of that. He's a first baseman where they need him to be a 40 and 100 guy. Like he has to be that run producer in the middle of the lineup. And there's just been very large stretches of his still, small sample size of a career, but from his career so far, where we've seen this guy go ice cold. So he's a guy that I think the Tigers, more than anyone, would have liked to see get off to a fast start because they need him in the middle of that lineup.
I think the biggest shadow in baseball, and it still exists even a decade after this guy has retired, is in New York. If you're a shortstop for the Yankees, Derek Jeter, leader, all the World Series rings, we know that. And that shadow still looms large for someone like Anthony Volpe, who grew up watching him. But in other cities and in other markets, there are still those shadows. And I think for Spencer Torkelson, again, without being in that market and reading the newspapers and going online every day, that there's conversations going on about, well, what did Miguel Cabrera mean to this organization and what he was able to do? This first ballot Hall of Famer, first base DH. And so Spencer Torkelson really is trying to fill those shoes a little bit. And you have to, wonder if you press a little bit, which is very common for young players. It's common for more veteran players. I've seen many guys do that in the early season when your team is struggling, trying to do way too much on both sides of the ball. So you have to wonder how much of that's a factor for Torkelson saying, all right, Miggy's gone. Now I need to step up, maybe be more of a leader in the clubhouse, certainly be a bigger leader on the box score and over at first base in the middle of that lineup. So that could be a part of the equation as well.
A couple interesting parts from what you said there. From one, Zach Short, who's on the Mets now, is listening to his podcast, The Compound, and it was talking about facing the Tigers. Just one of the comments that he said is that's a clubhouse that is very much run by the young players because the young players have been there longer than the veterans. I'm sure some of these guys like Mark Canha, Gio Urshela that came in aren't getting a voice, but it's that young core, it's their team. So that really is something that he maybe does have that extra weight on his shoulders to be that leader. And also, I think maybe a future who's better topic is going to be the guys that cast the shadow, because when you mentioned that, I know for the Mets, David Wright has cast a shadow over third base for a long time. And just now we're seeing a couple weeks of Brett Beatty offer a glimmer of hope. But yeah, when you have a player that mans a position for a decade and is so identified with that franchise, it is hard to find the next one. So that's a lot on Torkelson's shoulders. And, I wanted to also look at, the Cardinals, and I was thinking again with the shadows, like, well, I guess Paul Goldschmidt, did he kind of erase the Pujols shadow, though they were teammates for a little bit there? But that's one that's concerning. Just looking at the Cardinals, the two guys at the corner, Goldschmidt and Arenado, because they had, they both were MVP, first and third in MVP, I believe, in 2022, and they took a step back last year. Goldschmidt going to be a free agent this year at 36, 37. So getting off the slow starts, that's definitely another couple that we got to monitor.
Yeah, as you said, the age being a question of, okay, is this really where we finally start to see that decline? And there could be just, again, some ebbs and flows, right, where you take a step back and then you kind of normalize just a little bit. That's hard to know, and it's going to happen at some point, right? I think Cardinals fans are probably a little surprised when, so much has turned over on that roster and almost within the organization, at least in regards to their success. Nolan Arenado probably a little bit more puzzling because of how consistent he's been throughout his career. I mean, you look at last year, and when it came to consistency, he had 10 consecutive Gold Gloves to start his career, something that only Ichiro Suzuki had accomplished at that point. Several Platinum Glove awards he had won, and yet wasn't even a finalist defensively. So still had a good year with 26 homers and 93 RBI at the plate. But he's also going through. They both only have one homer. I think they're both under 10 RBI each. And so if that franchise is going to have, any hope of resetting and getting back to the postseason, it's integral for them to go out and be the perennial all-stars and perennial MVP candidates that they've been. Because if it's not, I mean, that hoists a lot of pressure on the shoulders of so many of those young guys that have been doing it a little bit here and there over the last couple of years. They're going to be forced, all the different Nolan Gorman, Dylan Carlson types, Mason Wynn now, Jordan Walker, et cetera, et cetera. It becomes a lot less feasible and sustainable, really, to be a contender, even in a weak division like the NL Central.
You're right, and honestly, having those veterans performing makes it easier on all those guys because it just takes the pressure off. So like you said, now the pressure is ratcheted up. It's not necessarily an environment that's as conducive to get the performance out of the young guys that you need. So that's it puts the Cardinals in question when those guys aren't clicking. When they're great, the team generally can follow. So there are definitely a few and a couple more that fit that boat. I want to go through Byron Buxton now because this Twins team has had a rough start, and they're just getting ravaged by injury. Carlos Correa now on the IL. Royce Lewis out for an extended period. Byron Buxton is healthy. So part of me wants to just shake off the slow start offensively and say, hey, at least he's making diving Superman catches again in the outfield. It's awesome to see Byron Buxton back on the field. But now there is a ton of pressure on him to deliver offensively because that lineup looks a lot weaker than we were all expecting, this offseason.
In the 8 years since he debuted, he's played over 100 games once in his career. That's what we're dealing with. He's played 92 games twice. So by no means am I trying to skew the numbers there. So yeah, the health piece is critical for the Twins as a team right now, but also for Byron Buxton. And I think, we see this more with pitchers than position players, where the pitchers go out and just ratchet it up to as close to 100 as you can. And all right, if you get hurt, we kind of expect that, right? To give it your 100%, and then it's kind of accepted. And for position players, I think that's true for some of them. I mean, think of the early days of Bryce Harper in his career, where he's trying to run through walls almost literally, and he had to kind of scale things back, and that didn't hurt his production. But we're at a point now with Byron Buxton that, what? We need you to be healthy. And so being healthy might take a certain edge away from, the best version of himself. So, how much is he learning to be a new player at, his age 30 season, where he has to kind of maybe not go 100% so that he can play over 100 games and be there for his team each and every day in the lineup. That could lead to some productivity issues.
Yeah, you really do have to, if you want to be available, you got to pick and choose the times to go after it. And I've heard, you look at Brandon Nimmo as a player, kind of similar to Buxton as far as the earlier part of the career where he kept on getting hurt. And Jay Bruce really instructed him on, look, there's times where you go crashing into the wall and there's times where you don't. In the fourth inning, don't go crashing the wall to make a catch. If it's a tie game and it's the eighth inning and that's the difference between winning the ball game, all right, that's when you got to put your body on the line. But sometimes you really got to hold it back. And hopefully Buxton has learned that lesson. And because he has been so productive in the, whenever he has been healthy in the past, I imagine he's going to get to some semblance of himself offensively. But right now they need him to be like a MVP type offensive player. And I don't know if he still has that in him after not playing much over the last couple of years. Now we end this segment with the guy I'm least concerned about, and that's Julio Rodriguez. He got off to a slow start last year. He figured it out. I am not concerned about the young superstar. Are you concerned at all about him?
A little bit.
Okay.
More a little bit. And I don't know if you saw today's Mariners game, but he got picked off of first base with 2 outs in the 9th. That's what's concerning me.
Yeah. Okay.
Coupled with his productivity. So in that sense, again, is it doing too much? Does he need some kind of reset? I think it would be extreme to say, they would option him down to the minors, a guy who was an MVP pick for a lot of people, but the Rockies had to do that with Kyle Freeland, 4th in Cy Young Award voting in 2018, get sent down to the minors because things just kind of got out of whack for him a little bit the season after. So I think we still have a ways to go before something like that happens in Seattle. But I think there's concerns that, maybe he is trying to do a little too much. Another guy that, who is he living in the shadow of? Ken Griffey Jr., because he's the face of the franchise. He is in many ways the face of Major League Baseball. He's doing commercials with Ichiro Suzuki. Yes, he's been doing that, for the last couple years. So it's by no means this brand new environment or situation that he's been thrust into. But players in their career, they always want to be taking steps forward. I've seen it many times with different guys who, really wanted to establish themselves just as an everyday ball player, right? The average lifespan of a big leaguer is like 3 years. So you make it to the show and then you're trying to just establish yourself. I've seen hundreds of those guys. Then you got guys who establish themselves and now they're trying to take it to the next level and become all-star. There's maybe hundreds of them. There's 100 of them, I should say. And then you got guys that already all are all-stars and they want to be MVP caliber players. Nolan Arenado was like that. That was a source of some of his frustration before ultimately wanting to get out of Colorado. And so is Julio really trying to bite off more than he can chew? Again, don't really know unless you're down there on the beat. But I'm concerned, and I hope that he does get the support and whatever it is that he needs right now, he gets that because it hasn't been good. It's not been good so far.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where the whole team has really struggled, and you're right, that might make him try to do more, but I think the talent, like I would be stunned if he didn't end up with a productive season. But yeah, you're right. He came into this year and I am sure that he had that goal written right on top of his page. I'm sure, of course, World Series, all of the team stuff, but the personal goals, he wants to be an MVP. And he very much at this point in his career has been on kind of a Mike Trout-esque start where it's like, this could be that next guy that we're all going to say is the best player in baseball for a decade. So he's got to really produce. And if he does produce, Patrick, you know where he's going to end up?
Cooperstown?
SNL. How about that? We didn't think about J-Rod.
Yes, that's the one. You nailed it. You nailed it.
Circle. All right.
Look, I'm concerned, but yes, would I be more inclined to say he's going to figure out? Absolutely. Yeah. Right. It ate at him a little bit in a good way that Ronald Acuna is getting all the attention for being the power speed combo. Julio was close, right? 32 homers, 37 RBI, or 37 stolen bases. So like it's in his head. Like he's aware of that. And again, maybe it's just doing too much. So I'm concerned that he's put that kind of pressure on him, but I'm sure Scott Service and his staff are going to talk and say, we love you, J-Rod. You're good. You can't win you can't break a tie or get us the tie from first base with 2 outs like that. You're not going to steal all 3 bases. So he's got to figure some things out. Hopefully Monday will be an off day for him. He can reset.
Yeah, for sure. Let's move over to the pitcher side of this conversation. And like I mentioned before, there was a first name on the list on each of these that I looked at and said, yeah, they're just washed. And that's where I'm at with Patrick Corbin. I'm not concerned because this is Patrick Corbin. Since the Nationals won the World Series in 2019, he has had the worst ERA among all qualified starters. The good thing, I guess, is he's taken the ball for a rebuilding team. He's eaten a lot of innings for them, but they have not been good innings. So I'm not surprised at all that he's gotten off to a slow start. It doesn't concern me because that's what I expect. The only thing that I'm curious about with Patrick Corbin Is this one of these weird situations where next year as a free agent, someone signs him on a minor league deal and Patrick Corbin's like on the Pirates and we're like, how did he finally figure out how to pitch again? But maybe he just needs a new change of scenery. But I expect Patrick Corbin to have the worst ERA in baseball this year.
Yeah, that's not a surprise, but you're right. Again, as you said, he's going to get the ball. There are not better options, right? A lot of it is that situation of you're going to get the ball every 5 days, eating up the innings, right? Try to even get a little bit of length so that you don't damage the bullpen. You know, be a coach from within the clubhouse, right? When on days you're not pitching, so not a surprise, not necessarily a concern, but worth mentioning for guys that have definitely seen better days.
And one other note on him, because I remember the contract is backloaded. The final year of the deal, he's been making 24 about the last 3 years. He's making 35 million this year to probably pitch to an ERA over 5.
Which, to be fair, Ryan, because we know you're clearly just biased against the Nats. That is still better than what Steven Strasburg is going to do for the Nationals. So, but combined, those two guys are making what, maybe 60 million. From Washington.
I'm pretty sure Strasburg was making 35 a year the whole contract. I mean, him and Anthony Rendon have like the same deal. It was like 8 for 240 or something like that. So do the math there. But that I don't know what the settlement was. That Strasburg has now officially retired. He got out of that weird purgatory. But those contracts aged like milk for the Nationals.
I'm wondering if as Boris basically got involved and said, well, look, I need to have every contract record possible. So you need to double the Bobby Bonilla contract. So it's $2 million every year on July 1st until in perpetuity, pretty much. I would think for the life of the human being that is Steven Strasburg, $2 million.
Maybe it was. I mean, there was a lot of millions to be split up if they ultimately went that route because he was still owed a ton. Let's move over to some guys that have slow starts that we're concerned about that could still bounce back. The first one to me that is interesting is Luis Castillo because, I mean, we expect that to turn around, but you got to mention it. It has been a struggle so far. Really, I think George Kirby's another guy. I don't know if his most recent start was better, but they haven't got the pitching they were expecting in Seattle, and that's part of why they've struggled so much out of the gate.
Yeah, I think everyone's kind of sharing the blame there on that, right? Because you're only taking the ball once every 5 days. You can only lose once out of every 5 days. So he's been disappointing, to say the least, as I believe in the AL West pitcher preview, he was number 1 for me. So and it was really close between, a lot of guys in that division. I think AL West has some of the best starters. But yeah, Luis Castillo getting off to that slow start. We were both hoping, you and I, that he'd be pitching in Cincinnati coming up in the early week. That's not going to be happening. But yeah, the Mariners need everybody to just kind of chip in, do their thing, and they'll be okay. Again, we kind of touched on in the last show that I know Torey Lovullo has said it. They got off to a rough start, especially after that sweep at the hands of Atlanta. That, all right, we're going to have stretches where we're 4-7, roughly speaking. It's just that it happens to be right at the start of the year. So I think a lot of these guys will end up turning it around. And for the Mariners, they have nowhere to go but up at this point.
Well, the one thing I will note for Castillo, because since you just mentioned he's not going to start against the Reds, I'm like, wait, he did start today. 6 innings pitched, did give up 7 hits and 2 runs, but had 9 strikeouts. So a quality start for Castillo. Hopefully that's the first of many. And he gets the season back on track. Another guy that I'm maybe even more concerned about would be Joe Musgrove, because last year wasn't great for Musgrove either. So, that Padres team, they did a lot to shore up their rotation this offseason. I think a lot of it still hinged on Yu Darvish and Joe Musgrove being the 1 and 2s. And I guess Cease is now thrown in there as well, but they really needed those two to get back to who they were in 2022 and not really be who they were in 2023. So Joe Musgrove starting slow. That is very concerning.
He missed a lot of starts last year. Was good when healthy, but for a guy making $100 million over 5 years, Padres saying, all right, this is one of the guys that we want to be part of that core. Like you said, alongside Yu Darvish, who he himself got, a decent sized extension. Same thing, Dylan Cease, he's going to be around for 2 years, but they need those guys to perform, right? You can't be looking at the knuckleballer at the end of the rotation going, you're gonna have to do a lot more than just dance that knuckleball up and down the plate. So he's one that you have to look at and say, kind of coupled with the injuries last year, are you going to be able to hold it together for 30 plus starts? And the Padres absolutely need that if they're going to be on the right side of that rivalry with the Dodgers.
Yeah, they need a good Joe Musgrove. So again, another guy that we would think is going to break out of it. Similarly to the next one I want to talk about, which is Jesus Luzardo, because I'm looking at all of his starts now, and his two worst ones came against the Yankees and the Braves. For the Yankees, 2 home runs. They were playing at Yankee Stadium, so that can be rough. Going up against the Braves isn't easy either. But I am curious how much the state of everything going on with the Marlins has weighed on him. Jesus Luzardo spent the entire offseason with his name in trade rumors. And this is a kid that went to school in high school, 45 minutes south of the ballpark. I guess depends on the traffic down here. But still, he grew up a Marlins fan, loves playing for the Marlins as part of what helped him sort of, jumpstart his career after struggling in Oakland. He gets traded to the Marlins, becomes a new pitcher. So having to hear that and think about if I go out and I have a great start to my season, I'm going to get traded at the deadline. Now, that doesn't mean that he's intentionally pitching poorly to avoid that fate, but it's just more stuff weighing on a young guy's mind who also last year, he had Sandy Alcantara as the ace in front of him. He was able to settle comfortably in that number 2 spot. Now he's supposed to be the ace of this team. So I think he'll be okay, but just a lot that could be dragging him down so far this season.
There is so much that goes on behind closed doors and what goes on in the mind of a player. As you said, he's a hometown guy that the Marlins love having as part of their organization. And, perhaps there have been certain overtures from the front office saying, no, we don't want to trade you. We want to keep you. We might even want to extend you. But until you actually see the offer, how much is that actually lip service, right? When everyone knows that, all right, well, this would be the right time for a franchise that's pretty much in a rebuild mode, which is strange to say for a club that just was in the postseason, but they're kind of rebuilding and they could get a lot for him. So his name keeps coming up. And really, how many veterans are in that clubhouse to say, hey, I had to deal with that a little bit. This is what went on, for Alcantara. Hey, they did right by me. They did extend me. But that still means that I very much could be a trade candidate when I'm back and healthy after Tommy John surgery. So there's such a huge component to that, and him going as the opening day starter, he's going against every team's best pitcher, right? Like he didn't have to deal with that today in Atlanta. I mean, Charlie Morton's is fine and all, but that can be a real struggle and can be a big downer, especially when you're trying to snap a losing streak, which seems like the Marlins have just perpetually been on since the season started.
Yeah, it's not going to be a fun season for the Marlins. Luzardo is too good to pitch to an ERA. What's it at now? 7.65. Like he's going to cut that in half for sure. But is he going to have a season like he did last year? I think that's very much in question. And you mentioned the veterans around him. I mean, he's kind of the veteran on that staff, just because they didn't sign anybody. They're just staying internal. So I'm really tough one there. They could have signed a veteran that the Tigers did. That's Kenta Maeda. Bad transition, good transition. I don't know. Kenta Maeda is the last guy we got on the. Actually, excuse me, we got 2 more. But Maeda, one of the last 2 we got on the list. His start's very concerning to me because the underlying numbers, it's a small sample. They back up how bad it has been for him. He's getting up there in age, and the Tigers need him to be a really good starting pitcher for that team that has a lot of question marks in that rotation. So I'd be a little concerned with what I've seen so far from Kenta Maeda.
Yeah, I think he's somewhat of a slow starter in his career. April, March, 4.89 ERA. That's the worst of any month. Next worst is August, 4.28, and then 3.75 in May. So it very much could be that slow start. Has pitched in some more of the warmer climates, right? Obviously in LA, not so much when he was with Minnesota though. So I think he'll end up being okay. But again, going back to the conversation when we talked about Spencer Torkelson, like I think certain fan bases and anyone just on the outside looking in say, hey, I'm concerned about this guy because he's going to be integral in in being a postseason contender, you have to have the guys that you're relying on, that you paid, big serious bucks for. I mean, sure, 2 years, 24 million doesn't seem like a ton of money, but it is, especially for these teams in the Central, right? Like they're shelling out for him. So Maeda definitely needs to get in order for the Tigers.
Yeah, I think looking at the 2-year 24, the thing that jumps out to me is the 2-year part. If this year goes sideways for him, they're stuck with Maeda next year. You're right. He is a veteran that should be able to stabilize, particularly pitching in that ballpark. I always feel like you can tack off like half a run on an ERA just from pitching in Comerica because it's so huge. But he's really a guy that has to deliver for them. Our last name that I almost forgot to mention here, but definitely a player that can go either way. We saw it last year in the playoffs. Brandon Pfaadt. He was lights out when we got to the big games. But if you just look at his numbers from last year and you aren't focusing enough on the playoffs, you'd say, oh, well, he's just not a good pitcher, is he? Because he was bad in the regular season. Slow start again. What version of Brandon Pfaadt are the Diamondbacks going to get this year?
It might be a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. You're right. 5.83 career ERA. So he's actually in 3 starts, worse than last season. But one of the biggest stories that came out of the Diamondbacks run to the World Series was Brandon Pfaadt, and was the fact that when he was down in the minor leagues during the All-Star break, he was back home in Kentucky, I want to say. And no, he's from Pennsylvania. Why am I saying he's from Kentucky? I know he is. He's from Kentucky. Okay, reset. So yes, he's from Kentucky. Yeah, there was a whole thing about him pronouncing Louisville and Louisville. He says Louisville. That's what they say down there. But he's down in Kentucky enjoying a little bit of his break. And Brent Strom calls him up and said, look, I know you're in AAA right now on break with the Reno Aces, but we are going to need you in the second half in a major way. And you've got the stuff that's going to play up, especially in the postseason. And sure enough, he came through and delivered and was one of the biggest pieces to say, all right, Zach Gallen, Merrill Kelly, you don't have to be Randy Johnson and Kurt Schilling and win every game in order for us to win the World Series, because Gallen was just kind of mid, right? But Pfaadt, he was the one who stepped up. And you looked at the rotation going into this year and said, wow, Eduardo Rodriguez is your number 3. Cool. Slide Pfaadt down a little bit more. Then they signed Jordan Montgomery. Okay, Pfaadt's going to be the number 5. So, again, is this a matter of the pressure, or is this just a matter of doing a little bit too much and saying, man, I want to try to get back to that dominance I had in October? He doesn't necessarily need that right now. So he's a young player still learning. And really what's almost a first full season, made at 19 appearances, 18 starts last year. So he's still learning how to be a big leaguer. I would have less concerns, especially because the ceiling maybe isn't as high, but it's also a ceiling that he might need another year or 2 to finally reach.
I think I'm concerned with what they're going to get from Pfaadt, but I'm not concerned that Pfaadt's going to hold the team back. And I think they did a great job to bolster that rotation and make it an issue where, or not even an issue, make it a situation where if Pfaadt is awesome, great. We got a 1 through 5 that's up there with anybody. If Pfaadt doesn't pan out this year, we got 4 starters that we still like throughout the season heading into October. So I imagine that he will be a productive player, that he'll stabilize from what we've seen, but it's definitely one of those guys. It's kind of similar to Torkelson, right? Where we've seen the flashes. Are you going to be able to get to an all-star level or even just a above average regular level? So we'll see what happens with Pfaadt. To close our show here, to close the stream, let's look ahead to this week. What series are you most looking forward to here? We got a couple of interesting ones, not a ton of interdivision ones as I'm looking at. A lot of teams playing all over the place, but is there a particular matchup that you are most excited for?
No. Next question. No, there are good ones. I think we were on a bit of a high from some of the matchups. I think Jackson Holliday's debut definitely helped, inject some, definitely some excitement in the matchups. I'm still gonna be looking forward to them going, head to head with the Twins. I think that'll be interesting. I think Cleveland, Boston, as Boston, we're trying to figure out, are they going to be legit? Cutter Crawford starts on Monday. Is he still going to be able to deliver against a Guardian squad that's still incredibly pesky? So I don't think we've got any of those rivalry matchups that we discussed, other than Yankees Toronto. There is that going on. But for you, what do you have up there with some of the best early week matchups in MLB?
Yeah, I think Yankees Toronto is probably the best series just based on the rivalry that's present. The other two that are really jumping out to me, Braves Astros, because I'm just curious with this Astros team. Let's actually do a little quick score update here. They played earlier today, 8-5. So I think they ended up beating the Rangers in that series this weekend. So they at least finally won a series. Questioning, what version of the Astros are we going to see is something that I'm always curious of with the slow start they've gotten off to. Other than that, the other one that was jumping out to me is Padres Brewers. Brewers got off to a great start. Padres need to maybe pick it up a little bit. So I like that one. And then Reds Mariners. Just one last one. Couple teams there that need to start winning. So it'll still be a good weekend, of course. I mean, come on. Mets Pirates. Who's not going to be tuning into Mets Pirates? The Royals are lucky that after getting beaten up by the Mets, they get to play the White Sox again. So good for them to get their winning ways back on track.
I think Reds Mariners definitely has the potential to be the most exciting, have the most highlights out of any of those. And I think on Monday I'll also be interested to see how the fans, at least in attendance, and maybe there's a bit of an uptick in Oakland. We'll see. But Sonny Gray pitching in the Oakland Coliseum, possibly for the last time, a guy who was great coming up for the A's and doing a lot of wonderful things with that franchise. It'll be kind of interesting to see what happens when some of the great A's come back for the final time. There's not a ton of them still around, but I think Sonny Gray it might be the exception to the rule. And, maybe the last dive bar decides to show up, at least to tip their cap to Sonny Gray.
Man, the last dive bar, that name for that fan group has taken a whole new meaning. But yeah, that'll be an interesting series. See, because the Oakland's been playing kind of good. I mean, I think they have a better record than the Giants. So surprising start from that scrappy team. And I don't know, is that Sonny Gray's season debut, or has he gotten one more start before that?
No, I think that will be his debut starting the year on the IL and being a part of, I guess, what's now going to be somewhat of a documentary on the A's being this team counted out and trying to do the major league thing, right? Like, who's their Rick Vaughn? Who's their Pedro Serrano? These are the stories we need to know. They're only 7-9, but hey, I'm pretty sure that was the record there for Corbin Burns' team.
There we go.
The actor, Corbin Burns.
Yeah. Well, on Wednesday, when we come back for our next live stream, all Oakland. No, we're not going to do that. We can't do that. Come on now. People want to actually
tune in. Sweep. Look, if they sweep with 3 no-hitters, yes, we will do anything you want out there. Sure.
For sure. 3 no-hitters. Absolutely. We will be back Wednesday night for our next live stream edition of Who's Better Baseball. Make sure you head over to our YouTube page, subscribe. If you missed any of the conversation on the live stream on Twitter, we'll be breaking up this video into smaller tidbits so you can watch each individual segment of the show. You can follow us on Twitter at
Who's Better BB.
There you go. And you can find our personals on the side of the screen there as well. We'll be back on Wednesday night.